Hello, it's Cry here, and we're covering Curved Greatswords. Now you might ask, why Curved Greatswords? Well, remember Catch? He helped me with the weapon lengths in the last video, and he is probably going to help me with the data for all the weapon lengths. So I figured, he should be able to pick a video. It's my own way of saying thanks. We will be splitting the discussion into two parts, the unique weapons and the regular weapons. The regular weapons are more versatile and have a lot more options because of infusions. I'm going to split them into these categories because of the similarities. If you're new here, you might want to check out my videos on damage calculation and soft caps in order to get a better background into some of the mechanics in Elden Ring. If you've watched my claws or katana video before, you should know I don't just judge weapons based solely on their attack rating, otherwise known as AR. We must consider other parts of their kit, such as their motion values or damage percent. I will be mentioning any significant difference in terms of moveset or motion values, which includes poise and status damage. If I don't explicitly mention any of them, it means that they are very similar, if not exactly the same as the other Curved Greatswords. First up, the Omen Cleaver and the Magma Wyrm Scalesword shares a different heavy attack 1 and 2 from the other Curved Greatswords when two-handed. This is the heavy attack over a regular Curved Greatsword. You will notice, if we only use one hand, the heavy attack is exactly the same. However, once we switch to two-handed, the heavy attack of the Omen Cleaver and the Magma Wyrm's Scalesword turns stronger and faster, but with a much shorter range. The poise damage of this move isn't any higher though. One thing to note is you don't really want to be charging this move up, because it doesn't make as much of a difference. You're better off just spamming it without charging. The other major difference when it comes to the moveset is the Zamor Curved Sword Slide Attack Chain. This is a normal Curved Sword Slide Attack Chain. This is the Zamor Curved Sword Slide Attack Chain. One thing you might have noticed is how short the Zamor is compared to the other Curved Greatswords. So let's take a look at the length of all the Curved Greatswords. Once again, I have Catch to thank for the length measurement. Other than the Zamors, the length isn't that different for the rest. In actual combat, you can still feel the difference between a dismounter and a beastman's cleaver, but all the Curved Greatsword except the Zamor fall within this range, so just keep the relative length in mind. One more important thing we have to discuss for the Curved Greatswords that we didn't really have to care about much for the claws or the katanas is the weight. If the weight difference is something like 2.5, I'll tend to say it isn't that big of a difference. Dropping 2 points from the main stat for endurance usually isn't that bad, so I wouldn't go into detail when the weapon weight is something like the Morgott's versus the Monk's Flame Blade. However, the heaviest Curved Greatsword is 9 weights higher than the lightest one, and when weapons get really heavy, I think it deserves some attention. For every endurance point between 9 and 25 endurance, we are getting 1.6 equip load. We get less than 1.6 after the 25 endurance soft cap, so the difference in weight would play an even greater role if you have to go over 25 endurance. Because we don't want to fat roll, at least I wouldn't recommend it, we can divide 9 by 0.7 and get 12.9 equip load. We need 12.9 equip load if we were to switch from a Morgott to a Beastman, which is 8.1 levels of endurance before hitting the soft cap. That is quite a lot of stat points to invest, so we should keep in mind the extra cost of much heavier weapons. Alright, now that we have all the details other than attack rating out of the way, let's start by discussing what I think is the benchmark Curved Greatsword, the Bloodhound's Fang. For reasons unknown to me, this unique weapon that has innate bleed is able to be buffed by spells or consumables. It's baffling, especially if you account for its attack, which you will see soon enough. As a reminder from my soft cap video, the soft cap for strength and dexterity for a weapon without infusion is at 18 and 58. So why the heck am I distributing the stats on screen as 25 and 55 for a 60-point investment build instead of 22 and 58. Well, that is because of the way the scaling curve works. Bloodhound's Fang's strength and dexterity scaling isn't too far apart. The 23rd point in strength would give 3.56 attack, while the 24th point would give 3.54. On the other hand, the 56th point of dexterity would only give 3.41 attack. Therefore, it is better to invest in strength. It is also more beneficial to push strength up before investing dexterity to 80 points because of the dip and flattening of the scaling curve. Pushing strength instead of dexterity for the 85 point investment level yields 9 extra attack. If we really want to be picky about it, we can go even further and optimize it to 47 strength and 58 dexterity. This might seem like a pain if you have to do it for every weapon, so let me give you 2 easy pointers. Number 1. If the letter grade is 2 letter grades apart, you don't have to check for the weaker stat past the first major soft cap, which is 18 in this case. Number 2. When you're using the gear calculator, simply increase your strength or dexterity by 1. Check which stat makes your final attack higher instead of taking out your calculator and calculating how much AR increases per level. The Bloodhound's finesse is also a pretty good unique weapon art, allowing you to dodge out of the way with iframes while attacking your opponent. Because the follow-up with a strong attack is optional, you are not forced into a move that would put you at a disadvantage if you think the situation is not right. Overall, I don't think there is anything bad to say about the Bloodhound's Fang, and that is why it is such an excellent benchmark. The Zamor Curved Sword can be optimized by not sticking to the soft cap just like the Bloodhound's Fang. Here is Zamor at 60 and 85 point investment level, both optimized. If we compare it to the Bloodhound's Fang, you immediately see that it loses to the Bloodhound's for quite a large chunk of attack. But this doesn't necessarily mean the Zamor is a bad weapon. Its unique weapon art, Zamor Ice Storm, deals good damage while applying incredible amounts of frostbite and poise damage. Here is a demonstration done with an unupgraded Zamor so I don't kill too fast. The weapon art is basically the only reason why you would choose this sword, but it would be a good reason. Next, the Onyx Lord's Greatsword also has a unique weapon art, but it is much crappier than the Zamor. Not only does it take a decade to cast, it doesn't even knock back small enemies if they have their shield up. While it has B scaling in both strength and intelligence, its physical portion is higher, so you would rather invest in strength. But keep in mind, even though it only requires 16 intelligence, having 20 points in intelligence gives you better attack because of the magic soft cap. I optimized for 92 intelligence build to fully tap into the Onyx Greatsword, but if we compare it to the Bloodhound's Fang with only 85 points of investment, we see the Onyx's base attack is trash. It is barely higher while being split scaling, meaning it'll actually do less damage because of defense calculation. You can invest in either strength or faith for the Magma Wyrm's Scalesword, but you will probably pick this weapon due to its weapon art, so faith is your bet. Faith scales the weapon art better, even though you end up with less raw attack. At 93 points investment, it has higher AR than the Onyx Lords, and has, in my opinion, a better weapon art. I think this weapon is worth using if you like the weapon art. The Morgott's Cursed Sword has pretty decent bleed build-up because it scales to Arcane. Cursed Blood Slice is also a decent weapon art for PvE, although it costs quite a bit of FP. This is my recommended stat distribution for a 65 point investment level Morgotts. If we have 15 more points to invest, should we pump it into Arcane to hit the Arcane soft cap, or should we invest it into Dexterity? This is what it looks like for each path. By investing in Dexterity, we get 4.67% higher AR. By investing in Arcane, we get 5.95% higher bleed buildup. But having higher AR works better for defense reduction, so if we factor that in, you probably end up with similar numbers. I don't think it matters that much, so it depends on the rest of your build. Before we can move on to regular weapons, let's take a quick look at maxed out unique weapons. You can see Onyx Lords really is a trash weapon, somehow losing to Bloodhounds while being split scaling. As for the rest of the weapons, they are all potential choices, assuming you like their weapon art. On to the regular weapons. We have the Beastman's Cleaver, Omen Cleaver, Dismounter, and Monk's Flameblade, from heaviest to lightest. Let's start with Heavy Infusion. I ordered them from heaviest to lightest here too. At lower levels, you definitely need to consider the extra endurance, even though Beastman's Cleaver definitely scales best to strength. These are the stats for 80 strength. Next, Fire is the superior version of Heavy at lower levels of investment because of the extra attack. If you don't understand this, go watch my damage calculation video in the description. For Keen, I removed the Beastman's Cleaver because it scales poorly to dexterity and should not be a consideration. We see here Omen Cleaver is better off with Heavy, while Dismounter and Monk's Flameblade is better with Keen. And these are the weapons at 80 dexterity. Lightning works the same way for Keen as Fire works for Heavy. This is the 80 dexterity lightning version. Overall, these options aren't bad, but they are weaker than the Bloodhound's Fang at the same level of investment if we ignore the weapon art. As usual, quality sucks without enough stats, but it is much better when you max out on stats because of the scaling. However, I don't recommend using quality at all for Curved Greatswords. If you just compare the quality Curved Greatsword to the unique weapons, you see that it is severely lacking in attack. Just in case you didn't know, you can obtain Bloodhound's Fang super early into the game. The boss isn't even difficult because you can summon Blade for help. Yet, it far outstrips quality infusion that tends to be strong in late game. Is it because Bloodhound's Fang is OP? A bit, but it's also because quality sucks for Curved Greatswords. As for magic infusion, you would only use this if you don't plan on swinging your weapon around and using it purely for magic type weapon art to increase the damage. Otherwise, Code is superior. Code comes with a much more even scaling, and this is a good thing, especially for weapons with higher dexterity and strength requirement, because you need the stats in strength and dexterity before you can even use the weapon. The lower raw attack from changing the infusion to Code is sufficiently offset by the fact that you can apply Frostbite. Flame and Sacred options are two sides of the same coin. You will get the same exact amount of attack regardless of your stats. You're only picking between the element, so feel free to mix them around depending on the weakness of the target you're fighting. I included the Magma Wyrm Scalesword here because while it has more physical attack than fire attack, its weapon art scales better to Fate. And I'm assuming you're using the Wyrm Sword for its weapon art. Otherwise, you can always pick the Omen Cleaver if you want it for its heavy attack. Here's the Flame and Sacred Infusion at 80 Faith. This is a comparison between the 80 point Strength Fire Infusion versus the 80 point Faith Flame or Sacred Infusion. The problem is, Curved Greatswords have higher strength and dexterity requirements than, say, something like a katana. So even with 15 extra points of investment, the Flame version isn't stronger than the Fire version. Sacred and Flame scales everything but Faith poorly. Yes, Flame and Sacred still lets you cast incantations much more effectively, but the weapon type isn't built to complement incantations. As for Poison, it is a weaker status than Bleed in general. I have the numbers here for Poison in case you don't really want to use Bleed, but here are the numbers for Bleed. I know some people will directly jump into the conclusion that Bleed is great for any weapon, but I want to highlight the great amounts of attack rating loss despite higher stat investment. Bleed isn't a great option for Curved Greatswords either. Even Cold Infusion doesn't lose this much attack. And finally, do not use Occult. Absolutely avoid using Occult when the weapon has no innate Poison, Bleed, or Madness buildup, because it puts a large deficit on your stats. A large part of what makes arcane scaling good is the increase in status buildup. Any weapon without an innate status buildup will always be better with either Poison or Bleed infusion. Before we jump into the summary, the recommended option changes a lot when you max out your stats. Bleed and Frost end up with quite the high attack too. I ordered it from the heaviest on top to the lightest on the bottom, and also provided the Bleed to Frost conversion if you're interested in comparing the AR loss versus the gain in status effect. To summarize, we first eliminate a trash weapon, the Onyx Lord's Greatsword. The Magma Wyrm Scalesword and Zamor Curved Sword are good options for PvE if you like the weapon art, because you will be spamming them over and over again if you choose either of these weapons. The Bloodhound's Fang is a complete menace, with a very high attack at every stage of the game. It also comes with 55 innate bleed buildup and can be buffed by spells and consumables. You can't really beat the Bloodhounds at meta PvP level when it comes to raw stats, so as a side note for anyone who wants to power stance Curved Greatswords, I recommend having a Bloodhound's Fang in your offhand if you're not going to use it in your main hand because you don't like Bloodhound's finesse. Bloodhound's Fang has very high attack and long reach, which is helpful because your offhand tends to swing a little shorter than the main hand. As for the Morgotts, I think this weapon is also good, slightly weaker than the Bloodhounds, but it weighs 4 less. I don't think the skill will land often in PvP, but in PvE it's another great option. You do have more bleed than the Bloodhound, but the loss in AR is definitely more than the gain from bleed, so you will end up choosing this weapon because of its unique weapon art. As for the regular options, I don't recommend using the Beastman's Cleaver. The problem with this weapon is it is quite a bit heavier despite having shorter reach. You might as well be investing the extra stats into more strength or dexterity for higher damage instead of more weight to use the Beastman's. You also see from the maxed out stat sheet that it actually turns weaker than your other options when your stats are maxed out because it only scales to strength at base. Dismounter has the longest reach but the lowest AR. I don't think the difference in reach is that significant with Curved Greatswords, so I would skip this option too. The Omen Cleaver is my personal recommendation if you don't have a preference for its unique heavy attack. I think the unique heavy actually has more use than the regular version because of how fast it is. As for Monk's Flame Blade, it is basically a slightly weaker version of Omen Cleaver unless you don't like the heavy attack of Omen Cleaver or care about the 2.5 extra weight. For the infusions, I recommend going for Fire, Lightning or Cold around the meta PvP levels, which is anything under level 150. As you go higher for PvE and approach max stats though, Cold and Blood Infusion turns into your best bet to the point that you can even challenge Bloodhound's Fang in terms of raw stats. Like and subscribe. Crite, signing out.